Great. Good afternoon, and welcome to our City Council meeting for the Growth and Natural Resources Committee. We have one item today, and I think we are going to hear our staff presentation, then we're going to take public comment. I know we have at least 2 folks on the phone, and then we'll bring it back for council discussion. So I will let Ms. Hayward kick us off and kind of set the table here for us.
Thank you, Chair. So we have Pat Young, our Planning and Development Director, that will be primarily giving the presentation. Travis Crane is here also for more technical questions, and also there's a great deal of history and background with this issue that predates Pat's time. So there may be questions that he'll need to defer to Travis for a more historical context. As you'll remember, you did discuss this item on February 10th and then again on August 25th. And so both your backup memo and the PowerPoint today have not tried to re-represent some of the history that was in the memos there. We did, I think, provide some links to those prior board docs items in the backup memo and board docs, but more narrowed into some of the key policy questions that the council or that the committee focused in on at your August 25th meeting. And with that, I'll hand it to Pat Young, who does have a presentation.
Thank you, Tansy, and thank you, commission members, committee members. Appreciate the opportunity to share some information on this item. Once again, Pat Young with the Planning Development Department. As you heard from Tansy, this issue of what we're calling Chapter 9 regulations, and of course I'll talk about what that is in a little more detail here in a moment, was last discussed in both February and then at your August 25th meeting. What this discussion has focused on, as you will recall, is forestation and impervious surface regulations in our urban watershed. And so at our last meeting, we also introduced the idea, and we'd like to do that a little further today, that there could be additional UDO regulation modifications that would achieve stronger environmental and tree protection policy goals outside of the urban watershed. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we proceed forward today. So back to the urban watershed where we started with this conversation. I think you all are all familiar with where this area is: west of Capitol Boulevard, north of Durant, south of Highway 98, and east of Old Falls of the Neuse. At our last meeting, there were three key items staff was asked to come back on, which is what we're doing today. Analyzing the impact of a 30% or 40% forestation requirement in the urban watershed. So we'll do that here next. Identify legal considerations, and I want to thank Catherine Hoffman and Robin Tatum, who contributed to this significantly. That would be required to implement that 30 or 40% standard given our local authority. And finally, identify strategies to advance those forestation goals, both in watersheds and elsewhere in the community. So starting with the first issue that was brought to you all in February, and then I know it even preceded that, was this conflict that exists in the ordinance between the amount of forestation required in the urban watershed, which is in the ordinance adopted as 40%, and the maximum impervious surface limit of 70%, which is of course over 100%. So those need to be reconciled, and we have determined, and I'll talk about that in a moment, that based on the advisement from the attorney, that in order to apply a 30% or 40% forestation standard, we would have to apply a resource protection overlay zoning district, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But that's the fundamental issue here, is reconciling these mismatched issues that have led to a number, about 24 a year for the last 6 or 7 years, maybe 8, variance requests because of folks running up against this conflict. One of the things we were asked to do was look at the development of this urban watershed that I described earlier. And what we found when we did that assessment, as you can see on this slide, is that almost 87% of the land area in this, so there's about 7,500 parcels, about 87% is developed. There are only 88 vacant properties, which amounts to 551 acres, or again, about 13% of the watershed. and breaking that down even further, there's only a couple of large parcels. Most of that is owned by Mallinckrodt, which most of you know where that is off of Capitol Boulevard. It's identified in both our tax maps and our GI system as the vacant, but that is being used by Mallinckrodt for application of wastewater and other things that are permitted through the state. So the point being, it's unlikely that those would be developed in the near term, but it is possible, so we included it in the analysis. And then you see the smaller areas on the smaller size. So again, important point here is that this is a substantially developed watershed. Many of the properties, most of the properties were developed before the forestation standard was codified within the last 7 or 8 years. And so this makes the properties non-conforming to the UDO, and when a property is redeveloped or that there's an addition, a shed, or other minor or major improvements on an existing property, they have to come into conformity, and that's what's been leading us to having so many variance requests over the years. Again, about 24 a year for the last 7 years. So one of the opportunities I think we see here is an opportunity to amend the UDO to, if the 30 or 40% forestation requirement is pursued, we would ask that you would consider some thresholds or exceptions that would potentially exclude existing single-family and existing small properties under an acre, for example. And then if there are minor expansions like a deck or a porch, maybe say increases the impervious surface by 5 or 10%, that be exempted. So that's something that we would return to if you all choose to pursue the 30 or 40% forestation standard. But so transitioning to what it would take to implement the forestation requirement in the urban watershed or elsewhere is start with our authority in this space. As the attorney has advised you previously, we do not have the authority to apply a forestation requirement of the nature that we have out there under our current under the UDO as it is. In order to make sure that was using our correct authority, we would have to use this 1985 legislation that the attorneys provided you information on and in your agenda package that gives the city abilities to regulate trees much above and beyond what's allowed under the state standard zoning enabling legislation, including what's called resource management districts. And so the UDO would have to be amended to first create that district. We have not used that 1985 authority heretofore. That RMZD, Resource Management Zoning District, would have to be created. Standards for that would have to be created. The impervious surface limit of 30 or 40% would have to be identified, and that we'd have to rectify that conflict I talked about earlier. We could establish non-conforming rules like I talked about a moment ago, and then again establish that forestation threshold. But what that would require is both creation of the new district, so amendment of the UDO to create that district, and then a rezoning of that urban watershed area to apply the overlay zone, the RMZD overlay zone. And that would be a rezoning of approximately 7,500 properties in the urban watershed, which would have substantial time and cost and public engagement. And so, once like I said, once the UDO is amended to create the district, the rezoning would have to occur. It would be city initiated to apply this overlay. And again, this would be required if you all wish to retain the forestation standard in the ordinance. So we did look, I think very importantly in my opinion, at opportunities to enhance tree protection beyond the urban watershed. The urban watershed is a large area, as I've alluded to, 7,500 parcels, but it's a relatively small portion of the city. We believe that it's obviously important to continue to look for opportunities to enhance environmental protection and tree preservation throughout the community. So both the legislation that I referred to earlier, the 1985 legislation, and our some other legislation that local legislation that the city has, as well as the standard what's called 160D, which is the state enabling legislation for zoning, really does provide a lot of opportunities to enhance environmental protection and tree preservation elsewhere in the community. And so we could apply the zoning overlay districts, not just in the urban watershed, but elsewhere in the community. So that's something that you all have available to you. We could also look at exploring changes to our existing base zoning authority that we believe would have a lot of impact. One example of that is, as you all are, I believe, aware, every property of 2 acres or greater in the city that's developed requires 10% tree preservation. So we could both eliminate that 2-acre exemption, so that would take it down to small urban infill lots. A lot of the concerns and complaints we get at the planning department are about long-established forested lots in infill locations that are clear-cut for redevelop or for development or redevelopment. And we have the authority to, with a simple UDO change, to eliminate that and require that 10% on those smaller lots. And we think, and not only that, but we believe we could require tree replacement if tree preservation was not possible, if trees were diseased or they had less than 10% to start with. So again, citywide, we could have a significant expansion of the tree canopy within, we think, a relatively short period of time. So in terms of options and next steps, one option, and there's really 2 key options, and they are not mutually exclusive. They could be done together, or you could do one or the other, and that's part of what we'll want feedback from you all on today. Option 1 is to authorize the staff to develop that resource management zone overlay, RMZP, that we talked about earlier, that would allow for implementation of the forestry requirement in the urban watershed. We would then need further guidance from you all about 30 versus 40%, and then whether there would be exemptions or no exemptions for smaller previously developed properties. And then we would need authorization to initiate a city-initiated rezoning immediately following that to apply this zoning and go through that process. And we would need to report back to you all on timelines and costs if you all give us that direction today. A second option, which again could be independent or could be added to the previous option, is to direct us to do a detailed scope on opportunities citywide for resource management protection, either with our existing authority or through under our 160D authority or through application of the resource management overlay zone. Looking at best practices, looking at other potential models regionally, and then a second piece of this recommendation would be, because this is relatively low-hanging, meaning we could do it very quickly, is eliminate the 2-acre or less exemption from tree preservation requirements to require that on smaller lots, which again would allow for tree preservation in many, many more areas than we see it currently. So that's a summary of as what you well know is a very complex topic. So we're here, in addition to Travis Crane that you heard about, our Assistant Director is Deputy Director Ken Bauer. And of course, Ms. Tatum is available for any legal questions. So thank you for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great. Mr. Cox, do you have a question for staff?
Yes, I'd like to ask the question before we get into the public comments.
Sure.
The requirement or the option of an overlay district has not been discussed previously. So why are we discussing it today?
Robin, do you want to take that? I'm happy to weigh in, but Robin, I think I'll let you lead that.
Yeah, that's always been the option from day one, is that they would have to be, the properties in order to use this local act would have to be put in that zoning district. So that's where the authority comes from. With respect to Swift Creek and Falls, the authority comes from the fact that it allows, the local act allows these regulations in reservoir watersheds. And so that's how those two were done. So we've got to pick one in the list of the local act to do it. And that's really the only option that the state has given us. And I have never really maybe written a memo before, but that has been my advice and recommendation from the beginning, because that's the only option that we've been given. So
Well, I don't understand because, that wasn't my understanding. My understanding was that we might pursue a text change to change maybe the 40% to something else, or change the impervious surface to something else. Why can we not just simply make a text change to UDO 919 and 951?
Well, you could, but it wouldn't be following the right legal steps.
Okay.
What the local act says is that you have to, if you can exercise the authority in a resource management zoning district, and to put any property in any zoning district, it means that you've got to make a change on the zoning map. And so if you're putting it in that district, then essentially you're required to follow the map amendment versus the text amendment requirements. What that entails is there's extra notice for the map amendment that wouldn't be required for the text amendment.
So what's the difference between a watershed overlay district and a zoning overlay district?
They're both zoning, they're zoning overlay districts. They're used, they're part of our zoning provisions. They're zoning districts under the UDO right now.
Okay, so I'm still confused as to why we can't just simply make a change to the UDO without having to create a new zoning district.
You could, it just wouldn't be following the local act. It would exceed your authority. So, I mean, as long as it didn't get legally challenged, I suppose it would be fine, but that's not the correct legal stuff is all that I'm saying.
Okay. Okay.
And let me just say that this local act that we have has given the city of Raleigh, and it's also the city of Asheville, a lot of authority that is not given to us through our general zoning power to regulate trees. And I guess what the General Assembly believed at the time that it was passed is that we could have this authority, but only if we followed these steps. And that happens to be one of them. And, that's just what the act says. I will, and Pat or Travis or somebody can chime in, but if you're zoning over 50 properties, then the notice requirement is basically between a text amendment and a map amendment is the size of the ad that's in the newspaper. So where it definitely is a bigger task to rezone it, it's not, you wouldn't have to mail. Large scale rezonings generally do not require sending a letter to everyone. There's a way to do that notice. So it is more onerous, and it would, I think, gain more attention, but the alternative from the text amendment would, I guess, be that you would sort of have less notice and be reaching less people.
Okay. Okay.
And Robin, remind me, that's for any percentage change, or
right.
Not just 40%, it's any.
Right. The way when the original, my lights came back on, I look like I'm under a spotlight. I'm sorry, they're automatic. When the original forestation was done, it was actually done by placing those requirements in the zoning district definition itself. So when the properties were zoned Falls and Swift Creek through the remapping process, and so you guys jump in here, then that was already a requirement of the zoning district. So that followed the same steps. Now, if you remember, the forestation got in by coming in as sort of a different way. It didn't come in through being a part of the definition of the zoning district. It came in the tree conservation, which was a different part of the code. So there was sort of a gap, if you will, in process that we're just trying to clean up and make sure we do the right way. Did I answer your question? I might have gotten off on a different topic.
Yes, I think so. Thank you. And other council members, do you have questions for staff before we open it up for public comment? No? Okay. Thank you, Pat. Derek, I think we're ready for our public comment.
All right, Yvonne DeWald.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yvonne DeWalt, and I live at 904 Walkertown Drive in Raleigh.
Ms. Walt, hold on one second. I want to make sure that you get your time. Can we set the timer at 3 minutes, not 2 minutes for each of our speakers?
Thank you very much for that extra time.
Yeah, of course. All right, you're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, so I've introduced myself, and I do live in the Richland Creek watershed. I believe we can all agree that trees are important for several reasons. Air quality improves with increased tree cover. Rain passes through tree cover and its force is dissipated as it reaches the ground. Thus, rain enters the ground more slowly rather than runoff, causing erosion or stream sediment and pollution flow into streams and storm drains. Trees are natural coolers in the warm weather, and deciduous trees are natural heat loss preventers in cold weather. Trees absorb and block noise. Trees have been scientifically linked to increased health, and trees absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen, all of which are very important. But there are two other facts that are known but often ignored, and that is that large, mature, healthy trees greater than 30 inches in diameter remove approximately 70 times more air pollution annually than the 3.3 or 3.13 inch diameter trees that are typically planted by developers or new homeowners. The larger the tree canopy, its cover, the more effective the tree is in carrying out the benefits listed previously. Actually, I've been looking at laws and policies of neighboring states, and those are Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina. And I have found that we are not alone in our loss of trees and in our need to produce laws which protect the environment while allowing for development to accommodate our growing populations. I have also found that tree protection laws passed in the 1990s refer to forestation by percent of property, whereas laws passed in the 2000s refer to tree canopies. They are not interested in the actual percentage of land. They are much more interested in the canopy. And then the examples are like Atlanta, Georgia, where tree protection laws are under review. They're very concerned about their loss of tree cover, and they actually have an overall 48% tree cover in the city. However, 70% is in the outlying areas and only 3% in the inner city. Sound familiar? It's very much like us. Montgomery County has done their laws, and again, they do tree cover. I have found a lot more laws, and I'd be happy to share them with you. Obviously, I'm running out of time. I would recommend that we keep the 40% forestation. That fits the small area plan and that information that was put forward to you by citizens. In addition...
Thank you, Ms. Walt. I'm sorry you're...
You know, that's fine. I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, and please do email us the information you found. All right. Derek, we have one more.
Yes, we have Bob Fry.
Great. Thank you.
Bob Fry, 1409 Coolmore Drive, former vice chairman of the Falls North Small Area Plan.
Mr. Fry, give me 1 minute. Make sure that there it is. Our clock's reset, and you are good to go for 3 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to be very short and just say that what we're talking about is clean water, and that's the priority. I think that's the ultimate goal that we're trying to accomplish. And I think it's very clear, the previous speaker has made it clear, you understand science and you understand that tree preservation is critically important, stabilization of the soil to eliminate sedimentation runoff, that forestation probably should not, in my opinion, be less than 35% of the area that we're talking about. And the impervious area should not be less than 65%. I understand the issue, and now we're dealing with a zoning overlay district. So those are the percent. I would go by percentages. Having been a developer with larger parcels, I adhere to that. We were able to land plan and manage around those percentages and create a stable site and eliminate the risk of contaminating our rivers and our waters. So I would just simply say that we need to keep stringent forestation requirements and tree protection.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Fry.
That's it.
Great.
I said I'd be short.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Derek, do we have anybody else? I just want to make sure.
Nobody else.
All right. Thank you very much. So we'll bring this item back to the table and open it up for any additional questions or comments from council. Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask Pat a question. Sorry, the points made by the speakers. I just want to make sure I'm clear on something. Pat's still available.
Yeah, I'm here. That's moving the camera.
Okay, gotcha. Hey, thanks, Pat. On your presentation under undeveloped properties, urban watershed properties, but this is focused on the one we're talking about. And so it's about 500 and say 50-ish acres that are currently undeveloped in that watershed, that urban watershed, and 417 of those are owned by one company. Correct. And and also you mentioned that it sounds like they're doing some sort of wastewater or what's the word, depositing on that land. So in other words, is it now not forested?
That's correct, Councilmember Knight. It would be difficult and challenging, but not impossible to redevelop the property because of this land application. Essentially, it's state-regulated, treated wastewater that makes it, difficult or unlikely, but possible to redevelop. So your characterization is correct, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. So practically, we're talking all acres, all property, all forests are important, but it's less than 100 acres that we're talking about that practically could be redeveloped. That we're talking about possibly going through this process about. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. It's just over 100 acres that are undeveloped out of 4,000.
A lot.
I'm sorry. I want to get the number right. I didn't want to misquote it, but over 4,000 acres. So about just over 100 acres, exempting the Malincrop property out of about 4,000 acres in the watershed.
All right. Thank you. I may have more questions later. Appreciate that.
4,700, excuse me.
Thank you.
Council have other questions or thoughts? Mr. Cox. You're muted, Mr. Cox.
Sorry about that.
All good.
So I was looking at the same chart. So the properties that are 0 to 2 acres, there's 62 of them, and they account for 37 acres. So that's less than 1% of the total acreage of the watershed. And so I believe Pat made a comment that we should consider granting an exemption to those properties, and I just wanted to note that I would be okay with that because it would be of a very small impact. But in general, I am concerned about redevelopment, and even if property is developed today, it could be developed in the future, and so I would still like to be able to keep, excuse me, at least the 30%, if not more, forestation requirement for the watershed. So that would be my view. I'm not really concerned about the undeveloped properties. I am concerned about redevelopment of developed properties in the future.
So one thing that struck me is what Mr. Knight's focused on, or his question was focused on, which is that, Mr. Cox, I hear you on your concern about redevelopment, but only 3% of this watershed is really at play here, and less than that once you take out the properties that are smaller than 2 acres. When I got briefed on this, my head was spinning in terms of how much work it would take to then go out and map and do the new resource management zoning district and then do the city initiated rezoning for basically 130 some odd acres. And so I was trying to remember what options we had taken off the table at our last meeting that may be worth us bringing back up now. Because I think at that time we were under the impression that there might be another way to do this. And it's clear now that there's not. We would have to move forward in this way if we're going to be on the up and up. And so option number 4 from our August meeting was remove the forestation standard in the urban watershed overlay district and leave the maximum impervious surface limit. So that would be the 60 or 70%. And while initially hearing that, it felt like that is not an option at all. I think for me, in thinking about practicality and good governance, that is the very clear option.
I disagree with that.
That is fine. Thank you for your comment. Please let me finish. For me, that is back on the table, especially with the realization that these tools are now in play, that we could not only protect 3% of this smaller watershed and instead put it in place over the entire city and figure out how do we do better tree conservation that would match our strategic planning goals for all districts rather than just this limited area.
We have an immediate need within the watershed right now. I mean, some property over.
Mr. Cox, there's an immediate need throughout the city. And
but there is an immediate need within the watershed. There is 15 acres that's already been rezoned. It's at the corner of Raven Ridge and Falls of News. If we do this, I guarantee you the developer will come in and clear cut that land.
Are you done?
And that is not what we want. So either you're going to support your constituents here in this area or you're not.
I'm curious.
And you're either going to support me or you're not. You're either going to support me or you're not, and you're going to support your constituents or you're not. If you take the approach that we're going to remove this forestation requirement entirely, I guarantee you that property, which is nice today and which a developer could develop by leaving trees there, will be clear cut and you will leave a mess.
3% of a small watershed that is not.
It's not just 3%. There are other properties within this watershed that can be redeveloped. There are large properties with farms on them. There are large properties with farms on them that could be redeveloped. They're not listed as vacant because they're not vacant.
Thank you. Mr. Knight.
Pat, to a point that Mr. Cox made earlier about the non-conforming properties, which is, I guess, the 97% of us really, in some ways, practically developed as, or that won't be developed as even more greater than 97%. But to those non-conforming properties, they developed under different forest rules or no forest rules. So in my point being, they may already be over and there's no way to get them back, even if they do a remodeling or an addition or anything like that. Is that, I mean, I know it's gonna be case by case, but isn't that, they weren't looking at the 40 or 30% forestry rules when those properties were developed. Is that correct?
That is substantially correct. The vast majority of developed properties in this area were developed prior to the imposition of the forestry requirement.
Okay, thank you. So
Forestation requirement.
And I appreciate what Mr. Cox is saying. I think we're in this conundrum where it's almost, it seems to me that this is not fixable going backwards. It's only fixable going forward. And the way that Mr. Young has laid this out, it seems to me that there is a better approach and not getting stuck on one of those four options. If it's option 4 that we pick, to really focus on this larger opportunity that Mr. Young and the planning department has laid out for us about how do we go about this in this place where this opportunity is here to do this on a citywide, comprehensive, holistic scale where we can get a lot more bang for our buck than we can over 100 acres, and not only enhance what we already have. And going back to the speakers, Ms. Wall, I think, talking about tree canopy, I think we're all very interested in moving in that direction. I think we've added some things to our strategic plan to talk about these big issues about how do we do this comprehensively and holistically. So I worry about transparency. I worry about notice. I worry about the legal aspect of trying to fix this thing. You know, I was going to say smartly earlier that it changed when the lawyers got involved. And I think we're, unfortunately, due to, I don't think any, fault of ours, it was, I don't know if you call it a clerical process mistake, omission made. And now we've got to figure out how to move forward the best way for the whole city. And I think that's through a comprehensive approach that Mr. Young has laid out to us at the end of his presentation.
Mr. Cox.
So in the meantime, how do we protect the land in this Richland Creek watershed? How do we prevent clear cutting at Raven Ridge and Falls of Neuse?
Don't allow it to happen. Don't allow the rezoning. If you're saying there's a rezoning come up, say we're pausing it until we deal with.
It's already been rezoned. They got their rezoning. With the understanding that the forestation requirements were in place.
Well, then let's talk to our lawyers about figuring out if they did it under one. They did it under the current standard. So, again, they're may come back in and say, well, we don't have to do it on that standard because you're getting ready to change it. But we can figure out some way to make sure that they, do our best to stop them from doing it until we get a new standard in place.
Then I don't want to change anything until we figure this out.
I just point out one thing just quickly. If you changed it and did away with it, if it's rezoned and not developed, they can pick the new standard. There's no question about that. That's called permanent choice. I guess the only thing that, you could consider, I don't know what they're going to do, but they do have their variance option too. So I don't know what their plans are as far as that goes, because that's another possibility that they could, try to ask for a variance. But right now, if you took it away and they've been rezoned and it's not developed, then they can proceed without the 40% forestation. They would have to, Pat can tell you what tree protection things would be in place, but it would be the same ones that are not in this particular watershed.
Correct. It would be 10%. It would be 10%. So we'd be going from 40% down to 10%.
Councilmember
And I would say thanks a lot for that.
Councilmember Ford.
Do we know what they proposed in that area? I may have missed it in the memo.
It's going to be housing. It would be housing. So there's a master plan. There is a master plan for the community.
Is it single family or apartments, or what are they trying to do?
Townhouses.
Mr. Young, can you speak to the 10% and what other protections would be in place if we did decide to get rid of the 30 or 40%?
Sure, yes, Chair Stewart, certainly. So just a point of information, Travis Crane of our team has pulled up the master plan that Member Cox referred to, and it cites the UDO provision. So if the UDO provision was modified, that would be the applicable standard. So there's no commitment to anything other than the UDO standard. So that just for point of information. To your question, Councilmember Stewart, the what we would recommend is that there's currently an exemption for two properties, 2 acres or less, that we remove that, and so that the 10% requirement would be on all properties in the city for tree preservation. It would make that consistent across the community. There's a very small number of undeveloped areas in this watershed, but there are enormous thousands of acres citywide where these tree standards would be in place.
And I recognize that we need a tree standard throughout the city, but I also want to protect this area, which has a tree standard, has had a tree standard, and we've had rezonings, such as the one at Raven Ridge, with the understanding that forestation protection is in place.
Mr. Knight?
Well, so we are in an inconsistent, legally inconsistent state or situation, right? And we have been, right? So it's no secret. Everybody, the lawyers know it, the developers know it in this area. So, I mean, I don't like it because I'm a lawyer, but one way we can go about it is keep it until we come up with the new city, when I say citywide, deal with this on a citywide basis, which is the option that Mr. Young has put forward to us at the very end of his presentation to deal with this issue holistically, comprehensively. And we could stay in our inconsistent situation until then and make them deal with the same things that everybody else has had to deal with leading up to this in that area.
Well, that would certainly be preferable to removing it entirely.
So, Mr. Knight, are you saying do nothing on this until we figure out tree preservation or conservation throughout the city, which could take 6
Well, that's
months
a question.
longer, right? Like,
is how long. I know. I think we've been told would be a pretty intensive dive by staff to have to come up with this, and then we have to go through rounds of public interaction, et cetera. So, there's no perfect solution to this. Either we keep it till we get something better, or we go ahead and move forward with what we think is doable and not inconsistent. So, okay.
Well, if we go ahead and remove it, that's basically taking a promise away from the people that live in this area that deforestation would be in place regarding the Raven Ridge rezoning. So I would expect legal action to be taken against the city if he went that path.
well, there's already threats of legal action because of the 40%.
Well, this threat of legal action would probably be a lot bigger than that threat of legal action. And they have recourse. They can go to the Board of Adjustment and get a variance to allow up to the 70% impervious surface.
Which is the problem we're trying to fix, is there have been 24 variances every year.
They can resolve their problem, and we can keep this in place until we come up with a citywide solution.
Are there, go ahead, Mr. Knight.
I was just gonna say, as far as you, Mr. Cox, this 15 acres is the only parcel left undeveloped that is now being in the process of being developed. Is that correct?
That's the only large vacant parcel. Now, there are other parcels that are still in the ETJ within the watershed that are not vacant, that could be sold and redeveloped.
Okay.
So I don't want to see the forestation requirement just wiped out completely, because then we'll have a lot more properties that would be redeveloped with maximum impervious surface and only 10% tree cover.
So the challenge of all of this, the reason why we're here today, is because we didn't take the legal steps to get and I can't even remember, it's 30 or 40% tree cover for this district. We didn't take the legal steps. In addition, there are properties across the city who don't have the same protection. And
we can give them the protection, just leave these protections in place.
That we
You don't have to strip out these protections in order to move ahead with protections elsewhere.
I understand and I hear you, except that the reason why we're here, the reason why we have been discussing this issue since February, is because we never got the authority to do this in the first place. It was put into the UDO. My understanding is it was a mistake.
It wasn't a mistake.
That's
That's a contention that some people have made, but it's never been demonstrated that it's been a mistake.
Mr. Cox, I would really appreciate if you would stop interrupting me. So my understanding...
Let's get our facts straight then.
Just can't with you sometimes. So my understanding is that it was a mistake, and that is why we're here, is we're trying to fix it because there's 20 variance requests every year for the past 7 years. So continuing to let this stand is further inaction, is further negligence. And unless staff has some ace up their sleeve, some magic wand that they have not put in front of us yet, to me, I'm still at the remove deforestation standard in this overlay district, and let's move forward with figuring out how to do this throughout the city.
But there's nothing wrong with taking a more reasonable approach of figuring it out first before removing the standard in order to protect this area.
I'm curious if staff sees any challenges with leaving this in place for some said or some unsaid time while we look into what it would take to put tree conservation in across the city.
I think this may be one that Robin might want to lead off on. I mean, clearly that you do, I think, as has been discussed by all members of the committee, is it does leave a discrepancy in the code in place, would likely continue the pressure on requests for variances from the Board of Adjustment, given the challenges of either reconciling the two parts of the code or the impacts of the forestation requirement itself. I think the issue that would not be addressed also, which again, Robin would have to speak to, is the question of underlying authority.
Well, and I don't really like to get into a lot of, here we go again, you know, legal risk and whatnot, as opposed to, you know, out in open session. But, you know, as long as it's out there, I think that, you know, there's a degree of legal risk that exists. Now, it's been there for a long time, and it's legal action. What actually ended up to, I can't remember, maybe Travis can remind me, we ended up exempting several properties based on the previous interpretation. So that's been resolved, but it's like anything else. You know, we give you legal advice, and you know, you have to pick whether you're going to accept the risk or not. And is it a big one or a small one? I can't say, but that's where we are. I mean, you could leave it in place and everything would be fine. And there certainly could be arguments that that's legitimate for 40%. I think we thought before that now that it was recognized, we could fix it. So probably we should do what we're supposed to do. Now that it's gotten sort of to be a larger issue, you know, it's just a question of, you know, whether you want to roll the dice until it happens, and get through something quickly versus more slowly. And I guess that's all I can say.
Mr. Cox.
Question. So if we strip this away and basically we're saying we're just going to leave the Richland Creek watershed just like the rest of the city, then why the hell do we have a watershed in the first place? I mean, we might as well not even have the watershed.
Mr. Young's he's trying to respond.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that, Councilmember Cox. There still would remain in place a maximum impervious surface limitation of 70% if the forestation requirement was removed. So that was the primary tool used in the state water supply watershed regulation to help protect water supply. So that's the best answer I can give, is that it still imposes
citywide. How does that compare citywide?
Yeah, so you're asking how does that 70% maximum apply to other districts throughout the city? I'll let Mr. Crane address that because I'm not sure off the top of my head.
I'll say something real quick too, and this maybe, and he'll know the things, but the state imposed the requirement for this watershed. And when it first came, the state requirements for an urban watershed are the ones that mirror the cities. So they're the same ones as the state requires for this type of watershed. And I'll let Travis give you the ins and outs of what that is, but that's what the standard is. It's not for a different watershed. It's the state rules for the urban.
That's correct. Thank you. For the record, Travis Crane, Planning and Development. So to answer Councilmember Cox's question, we do have impervious limitations citywide in all of our zoning districts. There were regulations that we put into the code a few years ago, and it varies based on zoning district. I believe the maximum impervious limit in the most intense zoning districts is somewhere north of 65%. However, there is an ability to go well beyond that as long as the increment of stormwater that's caused by the increase is treated. So in theory, you could have much more impervious surface. You just have to treat more stormwater. That's not the case in the urban watershed. It's a 70% in the Richland Creek watershed, the 70% straight cap.
So from a practical point of view, though, in the rest of the city, how much of it is impervious surface?
Well, again, it depends on zoning district, and there are allowances to exceed the limitations that are in the zoning code just by treating the watershed or treating the water through impoundment.
Okay. And Travis, in the 70% in this one for treated, and if it's not treated, it's a lot lower than that. So I think the 70 maxes out when you have put in certain stormwater measures.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct, and that's true for all of the watersheds. There is a lower impervious limitation if there is no treatment in place, and it starts at 6% and goes to 12%. These are regulations that we inherited directly from the state and placed into our zoning code, so they're identical to the state regulations.
So then really what we're proposing here, if we strip away the forestation requirement, we go to 70%. That only leaves 30% as non-impervious surface. We're really creating a very minimal watershed protection area because the other two watershed protection areas have forestation. So that's really what you're proposing is creating the most minimal possible watershed protection area. That sounds like very bad environmental policy because you don't want to go to the effort of doing this rezoning. You're prioritizing, the cost of this rezoning over doing and protecting the environment. That's really what it amounts to. Because you don't want to inconvenience people, you don't want to incur the expense, and you don't want to take the time to actually do the work.
So my understanding is that Swift Creek and Falls Lake are watersheds because they are reservoir watersheds, and that the urban watershed is something completely different. I also understand from an earlier presentation we got from Raleigh water staff back in February is that we're not likely to use this watershed for water withdrawal anytime in the future. And rather, what I understand is that it's more likely we could take our drinking water from the Neuse River at a future date, in which case the entire city is a watershed, a reservoir watershed, or a drinking watershed, rather. And so, again, coming back to doing this for the entire city in some form or fashion makes much more sense to me than to the benefit of Mr. Cox, just your district.
My district covers all of My district covers all of Northeast Raleigh.
No other district gets this special treatment when it has the same benefits to our future drinking water sources.
I am not asking for special benefits to my district. I am asking that we look down the future because the reason this watershed exists is to protect the Neuse River because it will be used in the future as a source of water for the city. So what you're doing is you're saying, let's minimize the watershed that we have in place. Let's just strip out the forestation requirement altogether and go to 70% impervious surface and just minimize it, and we will have this long-term impact on the Neuse River. And we will be using the Neuse River as drinking water, not to mention the communities that are downstream of the Neuse River.
Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the original intent of this was to fix a very specific problem, and we've gotten we can't come to a conclusion about how to fix it. And I don't appreciate trying to bash staff while they're trying to answer questions. This is, if anything, a policy decision, not theirs. They're putting out their best efforts, and I don't think you understand what they're saying. So what I'm going to do is make a motion to try to get us past this point. It's not going to solve it. Mr. Cox does not seem to want to fix it or solve it right now, but let's try to get past this point and move forward with the larger, most important issue, which is modernizing and updating our tree conservation rules for the whole city. And so that's what I'm going to attempt to do with a motion. If Madam Attorney, you'll help me with this. So I move that. So are we moving this? Do we move this and then goes to council? Is that how? Is that my request? Is moving it, making a motion to council?
Any motion you would make would be informing a recommendation for the actions of the full council.
Okay. So we move. The GNR committee moves and recommends that that the legal inconsistency applying to this issue stays in place while while the city, the council staff attempts to come up with a citywide tree conservation policy that may not be the same across the whole city, but we're going to look at the whole city in terms of trying to make and reform, modernize our city tree conservation policies.
So I will second that motion, but honestly, I think I will second that motion, even though it's not really what I want.
Great, there's a motion on the table and a second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. So we'll, unless Ms. Hayward tells me otherwise, take this item out of committee and we'll report out next week at council.
Yes, we will do that. I think that as I would recap that motion, just for the clarity of staff and mostly the clerk, is that at this point, when it comes back to the presentation you saw, there's really a deferring action on the inconsistencies related to the urban watershed. So no recommendation on the 70 or the 60, and no recommendation on exemption. So deferring decision or recommendation there. And on the second slide, in terms of a request for staff that outline process, next step, best practices, start that work, that you would recommend that the council direct us to do that. Is that, am I understanding?
Yes, that was
restating the motion?
Yes, I should have had you give the motion, but yes, that's a great recap. And basically using the last window or panel of Mr. Young's presentation in terms of the big picture, what he brought forward to us on that.
I think that's clear for staff and for the clerk. I see a nod from Ralph.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, then without anything further, we are adjourned. Thank you.